History has shown time and time again that for an upstart supercar brand, chances of success range from slim to non-existent. For every success story, there are literally hundreds that fall by the wayside. But the way I look at it, there are two potential avenues a fledgling manufacturer could pursue in order to be accepted into the exclusive and, quite frankly, elitist supercar club. The first way is how Pagani managed it, a marriage of absolutely batshit design with only the most exotic materials and finest Italian craftsmanship. A combination so exquisite that not only were they allowed to rub shoulders with the likes of Ferrari and Lamborghini, they got away with doing it right in their backyard. You got a lot of nerve, kid, but you're in. The second way was the strategy employed by TVR, not bothering so much as to straighten their tie or hide away the crack pipe before barging in that stuffy club like a bull seal and promptly producing one of Blackpool's finest vomit comets all over the faces of the establishment. And, to their credit, it worked for a good while, although perhaps it wasn't the most sustainable strategy. And, well, we all know how it panned out in the end. Ascari, however, seemed to go for a halfway house of the two approaches. Named after Italian racing driver Alberto Ascari, the first multiple Formula 1 world champion, the company was founded by a zany Dutch multimillionaire businessman turned playboy, giving them an intriguing, if slightly sleazy luster. But on the other hand, the cars would actually be designed and built in the green and pleasant English countryside, with help from some of Blighty's finest shed-building sports car whizzes, for an air of plucky British charm. It was an interesting fusion, but the cars were good, so when Ascari strutted confidently into the club, dressed smartly and looking somewhat important, the rarefied clientele didn't really bat an eyelid. But eventually, questions would start to get asked. So, who is this guy? The Ascari story doesn't begin with the man who is technically credited with founding the business, but with the guy who designed their first car. The Ascari FGT, as it would become known, was the brainchild of a certain Mr. Lee Noble, one of his many projects before he started his eponymous car company in the late 1990s. Up until this point, Noble had spent the past decade or so mainly in the kit car industry, being responsible for vehicles like the original Ultima, and also enjoying a fair bit of success racing the numerous cars that he had worked on. But for the Ascari project, he wanted to shake off that shed-built image and create a fully fledged road-going piece of exotica of the sort that would tempt buyers away from a Ferrari 355 or a Porsche 911 Turbo. However, there were some problems. The car certainly looked the part, but the body was made of plastic and fiberglass, was draped over a space frame chassis, and initially the whole thing was powered by a Chevrolet V8. So far, so kit car. But as it turned out, Lee Noble's background would pay dividends as he was put in contact with aforementioned Dutch billionaire Klaas Vaart, who was partaking in the one-make racing series for the Pro Sport 3000, another project that Lee Noble had been intimately involved with. Mr. Vaart, whose name sounds like the basis of a joke I haven't thought of yet, was introduced to the prototype Ascari. He drove 10 laps of Silverstone and promptly offered to buy it. And when I say it, I mean the entire business. The sole existing prototype, the rights, the blueprints, the lot. Which he did. Well, about 75%, with Lee Noble keeping the rest. So on December the 2nd, 1994, Ascari Cars was officially born. And on December the 3rd, 1994, Vaart announced his intention to do Le Mans. Righto then. That gave them less than 6 months to get a car ready for pre-qualifying for the 1995 edition of the race, but they pulled it off. Zwart had also got some very good drivers on board, but then proceeded to scupper any chances of making qualifying proper by insisting on driving the car himself. The machinery was good enough, but they wouldn't make the cut. Scaling down his ambitions somewhat, the FGT would go on to compete for 3 seasons in the British GT Championship. With more practice in the car, Zwart even had some sporadic success, including a miraculous debut win at Silverstone just 1 month after failing to qualify for Le Mans. In fact, the car was often to be found lining up on the front row, alongside the McLaren F1 GTR, or, in other words, alongside the very car that won Le Mans outright that same year. However, the Ascari wouldn't exactly have the best finishing record, so over the course of the seasons it wasn't exactly challenging for championships. But while all this was going on, the road-going concept was hitting the motor show circuit across Europe to drum up interest. The yellow car seen on the stands and later hooned by Tiffany Dell on Top Gear made a switch from a 6-litre Chevrolet V8 to a 4.4-litre unit from BMW, and production of the finished road car would start in 1997. Now named the Ecosse as a tribute to the country where Zwart had made his millions in the oil and gas industry, the car underwent a few more changes. The body would now feature carbon fibre and Kevlar, and the BMW V8 was sent to tuning experts Hartger for some extra poke, with later cars featuring a bored out 4.7 litre version making over 400 horsepower, and meaning that the 1250kg Ascari was, allegedly, a 200 mph car. That was very impressive, but the concept's pop-up headlights had gone, so honestly, what's the point? And, well, maybe the public agreed. Just 17 production examples of the Ecosse were built over a 3-year period, and each one sold at a massive loss. The car retailed from about £80,000, but each one cost £250,000 to build. That meant the quality far surpassed what you'd expect of a brand's first car, especially one that was built in what was described as a glorified greenhouse in the southwest of England. But that didn't seem to help the Ecosse's case. And I should also mention that by this point Lee Noble was long since out the door, being fired from the company in late 1996 after Ascari's newly employed manager was invited to Noble's home and happened to see the makings of what would become the Noble M10 through his garage door. Word got back to Mr. Zwart and he declared that the car was in competition to Ascari, despite having never seen it, and the fact that work on the M10 began before the Ascari was but a twinkle in Lee Noble's socket set. Zwart sued Noble, but they later reached an agreement to just go their separate ways. One could argue that the Ecosse's lack of success could be down to its unclear identity. It was marketed as a British supercar, but it was about as British as our royal family. Just to recap, Ascari, the Dutch-owned manufacturer named after an Italian, launched their English-built sports car with a German engine and named it after the French name for Scotland. Truly the original Mr. Worldwide. But with the turn of the millennium came Ascari's second chapter. First up was a relocation from the sleepy Dorset town of Blandford, yes, that's Blandford, and no, I'm not making that up, to a much bigger facility in Banbury, in Oxfordshire. In fact, that very facility today houses the Haas Formula 1 team. Rather fittingly then, the relocation marked a return to racing. Once again, with Le Mans in their sights, they created the A410. And this time, they were gunning for the big boys, in the top LMP 900 class. In true Ascari fashion, the car was a bit of a hodgepodge. The Lola chassis dated back to the Group C era, while the Judd-sourced V10 had 90s Formula 1 ancestry. Notable drivers included Zwart himself and, well, some say he only knows 2 facts about ducks, and both of them are wrong, and his left nipple is in the shape of the Nürburgring. As for the car's competitiveness, it was very much shades of the FGT's racing program. Both cars competed for 3 years, with a solitary win and the odd podium to show for it, but largely the car suffered from pretty awful reliability, particularly with engine and gearbox related issues. For the car's final full year of racing in 2002, the A410 was renamed to the KZ1-R, but little changed on the performance front. If anything, it had slipped yet further back. But that's not to say the cars would never get used again following the end of their racing career, for 2003 marked the completion of the Ascari Race Resort, a brand new 5.4km purpose-built racetrack in southern Spain. This was to be Svart's personal playground. Sick of being inconvenienced by having to hire other people's racetracks in order to drive his extensive collection of race cars, Klaus spent an entire year flying his helicopter over the Spanish foothills in order to find the ideal location. God, it is a hard life, isn't it? But in the end, he did find his ideal location. Situated on a former farm 10 miles outside of Ronda, there were no pipes to dig up or NIMBYs to upset, and thanks to the circuit's placement between the hills, sound was well contained anyway. Indeed, the only protestations one might hear were the bleatings of some mildly displaced sheep. Further out into the hills was a training ground used by the Spanish military, still littered with landmines which were presumably useful for keeping the riffraff out. Meanwhile, the 26-turn circuit ebbed and flowed with the natural topography of the landscape, and many of those turns were designed to ape the very best from racetracks all around the world. It was perfect.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Although perhaps it was too perfect. You see, Svart realised he couldn't just keep it to himself, so he opened up the circuit, replete with 5-star accommodation, swimming pools and fancy restaurant, to 500 members lucky enough to get the opportunity to give him $100,000 for the membership fee. At the Ascari Race Resort, you could either bring your own supercar or use one of the many provided vehicles in the circuit's pit garages. Everything from minis to the Ascari Le Mans prototype, to even one of the Formula 1 cars from Svart's personal collection. Just not one of the ones he'd crashed, obviously. The circuit was sold on in 2022, but is still used today for swanky car launches and magazine tests. Back in the day, clientele included the likes of JK and Martin Brundle, but if you ever did find yourself a day late and $1 short, it was worth bearing in mind membership came half price to those who bought Ascari's brand new supercar, the KZ1. Named after himself, this was Svart and his team's first chance to create a clean sheet design to his exact specifications. Operating out of their fancy new facility, each car would take approximately 340 hours to be assembled by Ascari's 30-strong team of craftsmen. One familiar aspect from the old Ecosse though was that power came courtesy of a BMW V8, this time the 4.9-litre S62 from the E39 generation M5. Here tuned to produce over 500 horsepower, it meant the carbon-bodied KZ1 could reach 60 miles an hour in 3.8 seconds and was a fully fledged member of the 200 mile an hour club. So it was very fast, and despite its lack of driver aids, by all accounts, it was a pretty easy car to get on with. The ex-Lotus chassis engineers working for Ascari designed the car to have a little understeer by default, and a ride that wouldn't shake a gentleman driver to pieces as they sat in the nicely trimmed cabin. However, all that and more would be expected considering the £235,000 asking price. Sure, the car's performance put it marginally above, say, a Ferrari F430 or Lamborghini Gallardo, but those cars cost £100,000 less, and, well, came from a manufacturer people have actually heard of. Throw in reports of some slightly suspect quality in places and the headlights from Peugeot 206, and well, you can see why there weren't many takers. Ascari planned a 50-car production run, but they ended up way short of that figure. Some reports indicate as little as 5 road cars were sold, or, in other words, less than half the amount of KZ1-R GT3 chassis Ascari produced for the European and British GT3 championships from 2006 to 2010. Once again, however, they were rarely troubling the front runners, save for a couple of wins in 2009 and a smattering of podiums here and there. Largely, it was business as usual, with the cars failing to finish more often than they did. They must have somewhat knew what they were doing though, because that same know-how was used to create the A10. Perhaps the most famous Ascari, the A10 was a 10th anniversary present to Ascari from themselves, and the KZ1's evil twin. Slimmed down and painted a shade of bumblebee, the A10 used the same V8 as the KZ1, but tuned from 500 to 625 horsepower. Combine that with a 6-speed sequential gearbox and proper aero, and it's not hard to see how the A10 claimed the Top Gear test track lap record back in 2007. Hell, Jerry Clarkson loved it so much, he reviewed the exact same car twice. Although there was a very good reason for that. It was the only one ever made. Once again, 50 units were planned, but it seems no one was willing to stump up the £350,000 for the privilege of owning one. Well, I say privilege, but perhaps that wasn't the most accurate choice of words. Aside from the inconsistent quality I mentioned earlier, customer cars were often delayed and the upper management installed by Zwart seemed to have not the foggiest what they were doing. In late 2007, after coming back from holidaying on his yacht, Zwart laid off about 2/3 of his staff. Every car Ascari had ever made had recorded a loss, and with the road car team now completely gutted and the race team down to a skeleton crew, it was a miracle that the company managed to cling on until 2010 before being declared bankrupt. The last car to emerge from Ascari was the KZ1-R LM, not to be confused with the KZ-R1 from earlier, essentially a road-going version of the GT3 car. But as far as a coup de grace goes, it was definitely a very good sounding one. Outside of the odd model being immortalised in racing games, Ascari today seem to be largely forgotten and arguably underappreciated. On the rare occasion one comes up for sale, they often fail to meet their reserves. When the original Ascari FGT prototype came up for auction in 2021, it sold for a frankly pitiful £19,550. Less than 20 grand for Genesis, the car that made Zwart see the potential and dive headfirst into the supercar industry. It had spent 13 years of its life abandoned in a barn, but the previous owner had restored it with the help of Lee Noble himself, no less. And yet, this immaculately restored 420 horsepower prototype racer for the road sold for less than a new Volkswagen Polo. It is a shame really, but you get the impression that for Zwart, this was never really a business at all. At least I hope it wasn't, because he was god awful at running it as such. He didn't seem particularly concerned with his personal legacy either. This wasn't a Lamborghini story, an entire brand formed out of a personal vendetta. It was just a guy having fun, and it just so happens a few select people came along for the ride. Or, in the case a lot of his staff, were simply taken for a ride. But as far as he was concerned, who cares if the supercar club shunned him? After all, he had his own. Seriously though, he was a bit of a cock. Well, it may not have worked out for Ascari, but if you also want to become part of an exclusive club for much less money, then you can now become a Car Harley channel member for just 99p. and you'll get some stuff, maybe also some things, and I'll be very grateful. But if you don't, nothing will change. Thanks for watching.